Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, April the 13th, 2022. What if there was a race war and the media decided that there wasn't, aka the Black Intifada? A man named Frank James shot up a subway station in Brooklyn, and this fellow is a race hater. No question about that. But the media, for the most part, has decided no, let's not talk about that. Of course, I'm reminded in this respect of the Beatles song from the White Album called Helter Skelter. And Charles Manson was a big fan of this song. In fact, it was rather the basis of his belief or his praxis, really. I'm reading from Wikipedia here. Charles Manson told his followers that several White Album songs, particularly Helter Skelter, were part of the Beatles' coded prophecy of an apocalyptic war in which racist and non-racist whites would be maneuvered into virtually exterminating each other over the treatment of blacks. Upon the war's conclusion, after black militants had killed off the few whites that had survived, Manson and his family of followers would emerge from an underground city in which they would have escaped the conflict. As the only remaining whites, they would rule blacks who, as the vision went, would be incapable of running the United States. Manson employed Helter Skelter as the term for this sequence of events. In his interpretation, the lyrics of the Beatles' Helter Skelter described the moment when he and the family would emerge from their hiding place, a disused mine shaft in the desert outside Los Angeles. Well, I'm looking at the lyrics for Helter Skelter, and I guess Charles Manson had a big imagination. When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide. That's a reference to the fairground attraction, which is called Helter Skelter, where I stop and I turn and I go for a ride till I get to the bottom and I see you again. Well, do you, don't you want me to love you? I'm coming down fast, but I'm miles above you. Tell me, tell me, tell me. Come on, tell me the answer. Well, you may be a lover, but you ain't no dancer. Helter Skelter. Oh, will you, won't you want me to make you? I'm coming down fast, but don't let me break you. Tell me, tell me, tell me the answer. You may be a lover, but you ain't no dancer. Helter Skelter. Well, look out, Helter Skelter. She's coming down fast. Yes, she is coming down fast. Yeah. Paul McCartney, who wrote the song, talked about it, that he was inspired by the sound of The Who, and he wanted to make something even more loud and raucous. Which brings us to Frank James. It is a curious thing about him. He is 62 years old, and it is very unusual for a man, well, of any race, of that age, to commit violent acts, particularly of this nature. And I learned why from the late Dutch American Jewish sociologist Ernest van den Haag, who I once had the honor of interviewing. And he explained that it has to do with testosterone, that by the time a man reaches around 45 years old, he simply doesn't have enough testosterone to act on his violent fantasies. It's just not there. You can think the fantasies, but doing performing them requires something of which they do not have enough. So a typical story, this is from NBC News in New York. See it, video shows suspected Brooklyn subway shooter entering station before attack. Now, it mentions that this fellow, Frank James, entertained terrorist fantasies. Yes, part of James's criminal history included making terroristic threats, according to sources, but investigators said the threats were similar to ones commonly made by those who were emotionally disturbed. So you see, this is a common explanation that one apparently can't be crazy and a terrorist at the same time. The nature of these terroristic threats is not entertained by the New York Times. But we can go to Andy No's Twitter feed, and learn lots about him. His social media and video postings show he was obsessed with race, believed a race war against whites was imminent. And there is a lot of, as I say, a lot of information about this. He retweeted Glenn Greenwald to comment, if you watch the YouTube videos of the named person of interest in the Brooklyn subway shooting, you will be astonished at the huge gap between his actual dominant ideology and political worldview and how liberal corporate media outlets are describing it. Or maybe you won't be. Li Fang tweeted, the Brooklyn shooter suspect has a long history of Black identity extremism, like lots of mass shooters. But many leftists simultaneously argue that this ideology doesn't exist and the FBI should ignore it. And if it does exist, police are powerless to stop it. Kind of a contradiction. This fellow Li Fang had also tweeted, prominent left-wingers argue Black identity extremism doesn't exist. They ignore Corey Ali Muhammad, who killed 4 in Fresno. David Anderson killed 6 in Jersey City. Mika Xavier Johnson killed 5, injured 11 in Dallas. Gavin Long shot 6, killed 1 in Baton Rouge, among others. And yes, he didn't like race mixing. And so for that reason, not a fan of the new U.S. Supreme Court Justice Jumanji Brown. Describes himself as a messenger of Allah, used 88 after his name, and 88 is, of course, associated with Adolf Hitler. And let's see. Here's some quotes from his social media. F you and your white ass too, you white racist MFer, slant-eyed effing piece of shit. You're a crime against effing nature, you Spanish-speaking MFer. Yeah. So we have a situation in the United States where, again, these kind of crimes are, they're not uncommon. And of course, this would have nothing at all to do with the eliminationist language used against whites, which has simply become a commonplace in the media and amongst the elite in the United States and Canada and Britain and other countries. So apparently their words mean nothing. Well, they do, actually. If you want to know, besides Andy No's Twitter feed, about this story, except, crazy person does something bad, you can go to the Daily Mail or the New York Post, because these are 2 newspapers which actually are interested in the subject of news. Yeah. And let's see. The Mail has a story, and the Post has covered this extensively. And of course, this James fellow was actually on some sort of government list, which doesn't mean anything, really. Whenever there's a anti-Jewish terrorist attack or anti-Christian terrorist attack in France, it turns out that these people were on a government list. It would seem that the number of people on such lists is so large that the lists are effectively useless. Steve Saylor writes, now, and I know that the guy who shot up the New York subway this morning in Brooklyn, so far no dead, thankfully, Saylor's law of mass shootings apparently works even in this terrorist-style attack, was another angry Black man. But do New York Times readers, many of whom live in New York and need to be on the lookout for this dangerous maniac on the run, this was written before he was caught, know that? You'd have to read pretty deep into the New York Times coverage to find a picture of the shooter. And even the New York Post redid a tweet or eliminated a tweet which had mentioned the race of the alleged perpetrator. And Saylor writes, here are all the images that the New York Times has posted higher up in their coverage than the picture of the wanted desperado. We have heavily armed police on a sidewalk. We have a traffic jam. People coming out of a subway station, 25th Street station, bunch of people on the street, bunch of people on the street, a van with a bunch of people around it, a map of the subway station, a picture of the mayor of New York appearing on a television, and then we have a shot of the carnage in the Brooklyn subway station. And neither video, yes, includes a picture of the wanted man. And then finally, after 1,563 words, 8 photos, 2 videos, and 1 custom-made map, we get a picture of the shooter on the loose. Frank R. James had addresses in Wisconsin and Philadelphia, the police said. And Saylor comments, the New York Times still can't bear to use the word black to describe the gunman. Mr. James remains at large, James Essig, the police department's chief of detectives, said in a news conference at police headquarters. We are endeavoring to locate him to determine his connection to the subway shooting, if any, Chief Essig said. He appears to have posted dozens of videos on YouTube where he riffed off news events in long, vitriolic rants. He blamed Black women for violence among Black people and pointed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as evidence that whites are genocidal. I guess he'd been listening to Joe Biden and Pierre Trudeau. Shortly before 8:30 a.m., the police said a heavy-set, dark-skinned man in a construction vest and construction helmet donned a gas mask as a crowded N train approached the 36th Street station in the Sunset Park neighborhood, tossed 2 smoke grenades on the floor of the car, and began firing the gun. 33 shots later, he fled. 33 shots and no one dead. He was using a 9mm pistol, and 9mm don't have much stopping power, which is lucky for the people that he shot. Paul Kersey, obvious nom de plume, writes on UNS, remember, the New York Times admitted 75% of mass shootings are made by Blacks. Mass shooting by Black male in Norfolk, Virginia happened because of a spilled drink. Yes, as I say, that it is curious and rather fantastic that so many of these shootings by Blacks, typically Black on Black shootings, are over trifles. Absolute trifles. This would seem to me to be a serious problem, but it's not one that's discussed, really. It's not one that's discussed. And the subject of the Black Intifada, where Black people routinely beat up and kill white people in the United States, well, that subject is entirely verboten. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Dawn from Beyond, Ann Run, who says, these pretzels are making me thirsty. Yesterday's obligatory Seinfeld reference. Hello to Head McNeck. Denny McDougall. Ann Run says, Riccietta played some clips from Jesse's older brother on his show last night. Pretty LOL and chilling. Hello to Dan Quachalango. Ann Run says, a fellow boomer. Yes, indeed. But he says, Suns baseball rained out again. This makes 9 games missed to rain. And Run says, we need to build a dome for them. Quachalango says, sell some Rice Krispies and build an indoor stadium, or divert some of that graft money, or play soccer and buy Tide. Hello to Palpcasso 88. Buddy says he's on a new team this year, so that will make a whole new group of parents to expose to the KMG show. Last year's group didn't fully appreciate KMG when I played it during game time. This group may be different, hopefully. Old Major says, I'm sure they're going to blame the white supremacists and Trump for the Brooklyn shooting. But he says they were tickled, however, when they heard boo. Yes. Joaquin 666 points out not a single emergency be on the lookout alerts stated his race, at least on my phone. Who else do we have here? Yes, Dan says, good. He's a terrible shot. Joaquin 666 says, also, what TF is up with the sudden mass of these COVID testing tents all over the place. Why have they increased in number so heavily and suddenly? I believe it's called the fixed cost or the sunk cost fallacy, which can be described as doubling down on failure. Picasso 88 says Gilbert Gottfried, R.I.P. He got canceled a few years before his death. He had a gig for some insurance company or something like that. Does anyone remember why that was? Anron says, stay out of Brooklyn. Too many hipsters anyway. And now I want to talk about, talking about the media ignoring things. The elephant in the room. The blue ticks on Twitter and our elite, they have a problem. It's not so much that they routinely ignore the elephant in the room. They have persuaded themselves that elephants don't, in fact, exist. Now, if you do a search on Canada, housing crisis, golly, you find an awful lot from Yahoo News. No silver bullet when it comes to fixing Canada's housing crisis. Chrystia Freeland says housing prices are intergenerational injustice. This is from The Guardian, which is paying attention. CTV News, Canada's housing crisis. Where will the millions who are moving here live? Yes. Actually, CTV News is actually flirting with a forbidden topic. Yeah, something like 1.6, 1.7 million new people, permanent new people coming to Canada over 4 years. But let's not get into that, because immigration is a good thing. It's a universal good thing. Everyone benefits. And if that means that Canadians can no longer afford to buy houses or condos or to even rent in Canadian cities, that's a good thing too, because they must be punished for building this country. Just here's an example. A woman called Jen, not Jennifer, but Jen Gerson, who has a Substack called The Line. I believe she was associated for a number of years with the Calgary Herald. And she got irritated when I reminded her of this. But in the Alberta election, not the last one, but the one before that, the one that the NDP had a shocking victory, she wrote a column just after the election had been announced by the progressive conservative government. And the gist of the column was, this is so boring. Of course, the PCs are going to win again. The only question is how massive their majority is going to be. I cover elections for a living, but it's so boring. Elections are held for a reason. It's like Chris Berman used to say about football. That's why they play the game, because you don't know who is going to win. I mean, obviously, trends operate in certain directions. But Jen Gerson has written 1,650 words about the Canadian housing crisis. And the words migration or immigration or variants thereof do not appear even once. Because flooding a country with newcomers obviously would have nothing to do with the price of housing, right? You know who's responsible? Boomers. Yeah, it's the boomers. Hello, fellow home-owning millennials and the Gen Z plebeians desperate to join us. I understand house lust. I do. You want an okay spot in the city free of the oppression of the landlord. Or if you're at that certain time of life, maybe you want a detached house in a decent neighborhood. Nothing too fancy, just something big enough to raise the kids, a bit of a yard, and still walk to a coffee shop. Or failing that, perhaps a townhouse or a condo, maybe. Maybe you can make a condo work if you convert the office nook into a nursery. Never mind. The suburbs, it is. Who are you kidding? You have kids now and you don't go out anymore without the faint aura of toddler vomit about you anyway. Aura of toddler vomit? Aura is not the word I would have used. Except, geez, have you done the math on what a house in Barrie is going to run you, or Medicine Hat or Squamish, big up and coming spots nowadays, and location is king in real estate. Perhaps this is your dream. Or if you have obtained that home 90 minutes out from anything resembling a downtown core, perhaps it is your nightmare. You can sell, but then what would you buy? So you're stuck in a box that eats more than half your income with no liquid retirement savings in sight. And that's if you're lucky enough to have grabbed onto this fraying rope in time for the snap. This is the reality for millions of people who don't fall into the boomer cohort. Boo! In Canada, it's why a lot of young and merely youngish people are incredibly pissed off. They have a sense, not helped by the pandemic, that this country is a vampiric gerontocracy, and that the ladder to long-term wealth, prosperity, and security is being rolled up right before their noses. That's right. In fact, the problem is much worse than many of them realize. Of course, importing large numbers of foreigners to your country also drives down wages, and it also puts Canadians out of work. But of course, that would have nothing to do with the ability of Canadians to buy houses, condos, or afford rental accommodation. Jen Gerson continues, every political party claims to want to fix the housing problem, but not one has the balls to tell the truth about it. Housing isn't a problem in Canada. Housing is an asset class, and one that must be protected and nurtured regardless of the long-term consequences to family formation and social cohesion. No government is ever going to fix housing, because the whole shady underbelly of our economy needs housing to stay exactly as it is, an inflated asset bubble with prices rivaling the most dynamic cities on earth. The first mistake most of us make is that we think of a house in entirely the wrong way. We imagine that a house is something that contains a few walls and a roof and is a place to live and raise kids in and host a few family and friends over for dinner. Maybe if we have a house, we can enjoy a lifestyle that exists as a pale shadow to what the typical middle-class kid enjoyed 30 years ago. This is wrong. You are wrong. Well, the process that she describes has been going on for a long time. In Vancouver, where I spent most of my life, this process has been going on since the 1970s. And guess which is one of the cities in Canada which has been inundated by foreigners. Of course, the BC housing market is, to a very large extent, it's a money laundering operation for Chinese gangster money. But let's not talk about that either, because there are things that you can talk about. Oh, yes, it's a shame, isn't it, that this housing crisis, but no, there's nothing that can be done about it. Chris Selly at the National Post has a piece. Liberals NDP have no good answers to Pierre Poilievre's housing policy. 2 generations have now watched boomers, boo, and those with family money get filthy rich, not just by sitting on property, but by actively trying to keep the rabble out. Now let's do a Control F. Nothing for immigration. Let's nothing for migration. So you see, the media tells you what you need to know, and filling up Canada with many millions of foreigners and their cohort has nothing to do with the housing crisis, and only evil racists would think otherwise. Of course, Pierre Poilievre, crypto, vaping, free enterprise. He has no problem with the Great Replacement, not at all. And in fact, one of the things that Pierre Poilievre wants to do is for the federal government to bully and blackmail the provinces into accepting in short order foreign credentials, because we all want to be treated by doctors from, say, Guinea-Bissau, right? The problem with foreign doctors, to give one example, this has been noted for many years. Many of them don't speak English or French or very well, which is, these are useful if one is a physician. There was a mini scandal in Britain a few years ago. The NHS, due to a perceived doctor shortage, I suppose you could train more doctors in Britain, right? No. It started importing them from Germany. You think, oh, Germany. Well, their doctors are going to be pretty good, right? It turns out a lot of these German doctors are not, in fact, German. They are African. And in this one celebrated case in Britain, someone died, was effectively killed by this so-called German doctor because he did not know how decimal places work, which again, that's something that you would want a physician to know, right? I mean, it's pretty critical when you're dispensing, medication, painkillers, the like. David Mamet is in the news. He gave an interview with the Wall Street Journal. His career, certainly his movie career, was pretty much stopped after that book that he published a few years ago, which originated from a Village Voice essay called Why I Am No Longer a Brain Dead Liberal. I wrote an essay about Mamet a few years ago for Canadian Magazine, and I pointed out that, if you followed his work right back to the beginning, he was never really a brain dead liberal. He is interested in topics like honor and loyalty and courage, which are not things which are important to liberals. This is from Nina Shakhnazarov. Sorry, this is a tough one. Shakhnazarova. David Mamet in the New York Post. David Mamet slammed over claim that many male teachers are inclined to be pedophiles. The Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright's hot take has prompted widespread criticism as he declared that we have to take back control. Yes, all newspapers now must sound like Teen Vogue. A controversial opinion, is a hot take. Speaking on Fox News Sunday, Mamet gave his 2 cents on the subject, his 2 cents or his opinion on the subject of community control of education after Florida passed a so-called Don't Say Gay bill, which bans sexual orientation or gender from being taught to children under 10. Mamet said, we have to take back control. If there's no community control of the schools, what we have is kids being not only indoctrinated, but groomed in a very real sense by people who are, whether they know it or not, sexual predators. Are they abusing the kids physically? No, I don't think so. But they're abusing them mentally and using sex to do so. This has always been the problem with education. Teachers are inclined, typically men, because men are predators, to pedophilia, the 74-year-old said. Mamet argued parents should teach their children certain topics instead of teachers. People have gone nuts and people are frightened because there's huge changes in society that are brought about by the people in power. The people in power, as always, are to a large extent parasites who are feeding off of the decaying flesh. He added that society needs to get pruned and we need to cut off the diseased parts and go back to individual control of our own destiny. That's called freedom. It wasn't long until Mamet faced major pushback on social media over his controversial comments. Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss, wrote, quote, the main takeaway from that despicable David Mamet clip about teachers is that Rupert Murdoch remains the world's most dangerous oligarch, and it's not close, unquote. Meanwhile, another added, quote, following David Mamet's career has been like talking to a guy at a party who seems normal until at a certain point he says, but a lot of harassment allegations are made up. And then you say, and try to change the subject, but then it just keeps going. You're having a good time with House of Games in Glengarry Glen Ross, and then all of a sudden you hit Oleana and you think, oh, that's weird. Well, surely he's actually approaching this from the angle of, and then soon enough, you hit his Phil Spector movie. Evelyn Waugh, in his autobiography, A Little Learning, which came out in 1964, 1965, and he was describing his school days of during the World War I and after World War I. He said that of the masters that he'd had in his schools, the Tony schools that he attended, that some of them liked children too little and some of them too much. I mean, everybody knows this, right? But no. It would be hysterical, to try and do something about that. I mean, grooming, it's just going to happen. So just, stop being upset about it. Back to Canadian Corner. Prime Minister visits Edmonton, criticizes Alberta's response to opioid crisis. Yes, he wants the Alberta government, to address the opioid epidemic in ways that have proven to be effective elsewhere. This is from Fakia Baig at the Canadian Press. Proven to be effective elsewhere. This is presented as a fact, not a claim. As a government, we've continued to push for safe consumption sites, Trudeau said. Yes, because people are dying of drug overdoses, but we want to provide friendly places for people to shoot up and smoke crack cocaine and the like. Because it's not the drugs that are killing these people, it's outdated opinions, perhaps. Alberta's United Conservative Party government is focused on a recovery-oriented strategy. Access to opioid dependency programs and drug use sites has been limited. It's unfortunate to see Alberta going in the opposite direction, away from a science-based and harm reduction approach. We know that municipal leaders, like here in Edmonton, are serious about supporting people through this terrible tragedy. Harm reduction has been employed in Canada, particularly in places like Vancouver and Victoria, for decades. So do we have fewer people dying of overdoses of illegal drugs? No, the number has exploded. But of course, the solution to this is more harm reduction. A Edmonton Council committee Monday voted to ask the city's administration to explore the issue of decriminalizing simple possession of illegal drugs by early next year. Alberta last year recorded its deadliest year for drug overdoses since it began collecting data in 2016. Government figures show 171 people died in November and 178 in December, the highest single month numbers ever, for a total of 1,758 fatalities in 2021. In a post on Twitter, the press secretary for Mike Ellis, Alberta's Mental Health and Addictions Associate Minister, referred to another tweet about Trudeau's comments as a joke. Yeah. The decision has been made in my country by the elite that yes, all drugs are going to be criminalized, and it would probably be a good idea if, as already happening, we give out free heroin to people, which is going on in Vancouver and Victoria, because Canada has gone crazy. We are led by people who hate us and want to hurt us. I'm trying to think of another explanation. I mean, there's stupidity, of course, but yes, harm reduction. But the numbers are exploding. Yeah, but that's because we haven't had enough harm reduction. But because, of course, to try something else would require these people admitting that they were wrong. And it is rare that people admit that they are wrong. And particularly if one is in a position of authority or influence, this almost never happens. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the air went out of the socialism balloon. But as Paul Gottfried has pointed out, it's not as if these people that have been pushing socialism for decades and decades were, hunted out of the elite. No, what they said was, we have this new thing called multiculturalism. That's pretty exciting. So you should listen to us and institute multiculturalism. Which are the same people that were pushing socialism? What? What are you talking about? I don't even know what socialism means. Let's go back to the shot. Ed McNeck talking about Gilbert Gottfried. Aflac. Yes, David Wright. Yes, he used to advertise for Aflac, and he would make a sound like a duck. Ed McNeck says his joke about Fujiyama. Yes, he was the Aflac duck. Hello to Gunter. Hello to Thomas White, Paula Oppenheimer, who quotes the Curé d'Ars at Saint-Jean-Vianney. We will either accuse ourselves or excuse ourselves. David Denome says, my sister lives in Brooklyn and she's fine. But he says Gilbert Gottfried made some tasteless jokes about Japanese tsunami victims. David Denome says there is no chance that the young creative set of Brooklynites will learn anything from subway terrorism. Of course, they live around only other white liberals, so maybe they understand on a sort of unspoken level. Paula Oppenheimer points out that Gilbert Gottfried got the clot shot booster. David Wright says only had a German doctor once, couldn't even diagnose an ear infection, him or his Jamaican intern. Gottfried had a genetic condition which caused his heart to beat irregularly, says Paul Casso 88. Based Mamet. Yes, indeed. He is. He is indeed. Of course, when a man talks publicly about the vast differences between men and women, this is even before the whole Troon thing took off. What do you mean, vast differences between men and women? They're exactly the same. But what about women being the only ones who give birth? Oh, well, we can fix that problem. How? Well, we can make contraception universal. And for those women who are, too stupid or lazy to take contraception, we'll give them abortion. And the government will pay for it in Canada. So that'll take care of the differences between men and women. Anron says, again, I once stood right behind Mamet in line at a Borders bookstore. John Vance, hello, says Jason Kenney can't even pump his own gas. What a down-to-earth leader. John Vance says something about Vancouver here. Hang on, where is it? Is the epicenter of drug use even back in the early 2000s? Well, last time I visited Vancouver was almost 2 years ago, and I was shocked by the degeneration of downtown Vancouver. If you go about a mile east, you hit what we used to call Skid Row, and it just keeps migrating to the west and to the south. No stopping it, apparently, because they just love homeless people and junkies in Vancouver and Victoria. And of course, that policy is not going to have any detrimental effects. Okay. Paula Oppenheimer says, according to Dr. Joel Wallach, 10,000 Americans die monthly in nursing homes and hospitals from easily preventable bed sores, pressure ulcers. Where's the outrage? Well, people don't die at home anymore. They die in facilities. And I suspect a lot of people feel guilty about shoving their parents into such facilities. So, yes, if they die due to mistreatment or lack of treatment, that's a sensitive subject for them. Hello to Martin Matushak, who asks, how are you doing? I'm doing just fine. The homeless in Canada move around a lot. You don't see the same homeless people. Medicine Hat has a lot of homeless population because they're superior work programs, says John Vance. And, okay, what are we going to talk about now? Let's go to my trusty list. Let's see if there's anything new from Eugippius. I've just been tremendously impressed by his writings on the subject of the distribution of power downwards. It's distributed power now. The elite and the aspirational class. And of course, these people hold a lot of jobs. Government jobs, NGO jobs, and they have a lot of power, a lot of influence. And if they all think the same things, then change is it's going to be difficult. Here is a piece by Eugippius, who is was a German academic. Yet another paper fails to find that masks do anything. A natural experiment in Catalonia is the latest piece of evidence that masking is a worthless intervention. As long as we're talking about masks, let's have a look at this paper out of Catalonia, unraveling the role of the mandatory use of face covering masks for the control of SARS-CoV-2 in schools, a quasi-experimental study nested in a population-based cohort in Catalonia. It turns out that childcare centers and schools in Catalonia have been host to a natural experiment. Children up to 5 years of age attended preschool facilities where they weren't required to mask. Children 6 years and older attended primary school where face coverings were mandatory. When you compare rates of infection among unmasked 5-year-olds to masked 6-year-olds from October 2021 through January 22, what you find is entirely predictable and in line with literally every other piece of evidence that has been assembled on this topic to date. Masks just don't do anything. In a post that he'd made a day earlier, Eugippius wrote, perhaps there is hope even for Germany 9 days into the lifting of the general indoor mask requirement. A marked shift in habits is underway. Fewer and fewer are bothering with useless plastic face diapers. As I carry out my semi-regular supermarket surveys, though, I've begun pondering all over again the whole problem of masks and why we ever started wearing them and what it all means. The story is bizarre. Everyone will remember that corona astrologers and public health authorities, from Anthony Fauci to Christian Drosten, advised against masks early on. They pointed to long-standing public health guidelines against community masking, which they claimed was powerless against viral infection. Then, beginning in April 2020, these very same people started singing a different tune. They had only played down the utility of masks to preserve their availability for healthcare personnel, they said. In fact, everybody should wear masks. They would prevent infections, perhaps even make lockdowns unnecessary. They proceeded to impose mask mandates upon the better part of the world. Lungs everywhere filled with new microplastics, oceans accumulated, a new kind of trash, all of it to no effect whatever. Older public health doctrine against masking, it turns out, was totally right. Mandates plainly have no effect on infection curves. This is because SARS-2 is primarily transmitted by aerosols. It works like a gas that fills indoor spaces. Only N95 or FFP2 respirators have any chance of stopping the inhalation of these microscopic particles, but the discipline required to fit and seal a respirator properly is both inconsistent with the low quality of commonly available models and incompatible with use outside of a controlled hospital environment. Thus, even respirators are totally worthless. I'm open to theories, Eugippius writes, as to how our pointless mask obsessions ever came to be. Right now, I have 3 ideas, which aren't mutually exclusive and probably all apply to varying degrees. 1, copying Asia. Corona was less virulent in the Asia-Pacific region, where masks are more common. A big part of how we got lockdowns and the rest of containment was a bunch of people assuming that Asia was doing it right and that we needed to copy them. 2, making corona visible. Consciously or unconsciously, probably both, public health authorities wanted a means of making the pandemic real and tangible to the masses. Pervasive disease statistics were part of this, hand sanitizer and distancing rules another part, masks yet another part. 3, maintaining useful fictions. A lot of people came out of the first wave propaganda campaign believing that SARS-2 had a 10% fatality rate and was likely to kill their kids. How could such an enormous threat be reconciled with the decision of authorities to insist on ordinary routine supermarket shopping to end closures after April, or to weigh the problem of reopening schools? Rather than admit the danger of the virus had been wildly overhyped, they claimed to have a charm that would magically save its wearers. Yes, we must do something, anything. Does it matter if it works? No, it doesn't matter if it works, because we are demonstrating, our goodwill, our bona fides by doing something, anything. Alex Berenson writes, a vicious and apparently racially, religiously motivated attack in the New York area. No, not the one on the subway on Tuesday. This was in New Jersey on Saturday, and it targeted Orthodox Jews. That's 2 vicious assaults about 70 miles apart in 3 days. Try to imagine what you'd be hearing from the blue checks if the alleged attackers had been white, much less loud Trump fans. It's not the heat, it's the hypocrisy. New Jersey man targeting Jews warned of bloodbath just before attack, according to prosecutors. Yes, and the shoot up in Sacramento, again, a lot of rounds expended and not that many people killed. And do we want to talk about who's responsible for that? No, we don't. It's guns that are responsible for that, because guns, as we know, are famous for their moral agency, and they're wicked. They're just wicked. There's no reason for anybody to have guns, except those people, who protect our politicians. That is absolutely essential. Let's go to the Daily Skeptic. Boris Johnson facing second Partygate fine over AIDS leave event. according to the Telegraph. Boris's real failure wasn't breaking lockdown. It was creating the rules in the first place, says Ross Clark in The Spectator. Lord Sumption writes in the Telegraph, there is a certain poetic justice to the Partygate fines. Mail reports daily COVID cases plunge 30% in a week and hospital admissions come down by 8%, but deaths more than double due to data backlog issue. Yes, that's the reason. It's the backlog. Nothing to do with experimental genetic treatment. No, nothing at all to do with that. And government official who drafted COVID laws is fined over boozy lockdown party. Kate Josephs, the government official who was in charge of writing the COVID laws, has been fined over her boozy leaving party, according to the Telegraph. Yes, well, what have we learned from this? We have learned that the people that tortured us, a great many of them, didn't believe in it. I was informed yesterday that the mayor of Victoria, Lisa Helps, was observed on the street in front of a camping supply store downtown, no mask. But when she appeared with Prime Minister Trudeau the other day, they're both wearing masks. Lockdown to blame for inflation of 7%, highest rate in 30 years. And there's a piece on the face mask cult as well. Sweden saw second smallest increase in national debt out of all EU countries. Why would that be? Because they didn't go mad. Too many in politics and the civil service had no skin in the game when they destroyed livelihoods and frightened the nation into compliance. This is what Eugippius said the other day, that, yes, why is this difficult to understand? Most of the people responsible for the SARS-CoV-2 terror and the lockdowns, the mandates, the masks, social distancing, all of it are in positions where it didn't affect them at all. Andrew Coyne of the Globe and Mail, who is still trying to keep panic alive, how did this affect him? He just stays at home, and sets the world to rights at his laptop. I suppose, in the early days, if he, went to the liquor store or the grocery store or whatever, or drugstore, he might have had to wait in line, for a rather long period of time. But apart from that, no, not affected at all. Anti-lockdown Florida and South Dakota among best pandemic performers. Pro-lockdown New York and California among worst. Study finds. But I made a prediction, despite the fact that, I've admitted I'm not very good at short-term predictions. I made a prediction in March. I think it could have been St. Patrick's Day 2 years ago, that after all the devastation of this panic, that our elite and the regime media, they're going to be patting themselves on the back saying, what a great job we did. Oh, and don't bother with that stuff anymore, because we've moved on to Ukraine, which is the only important thing happening in the world. William Briggs writes, will the Catholic Church change after German prelates say sodomy is justified by love? I thought there would be a schism in the Catholic Church. I've thought this for a long time, but there hasn't been. Can we please have the schism? I know this would require, I suppose, building new churches, but it's been done before. Briggs concludes, there is therefore the possibility the Germans peel off and form their own church, as has happened before. Given the synodalians are never punished and rarely admonished because of financial considerations, it's more likely they'll continue on their synodal path, preaching and acting falsely, the German church becoming more decadent and slowly dissolving with nothing much done by anybody. And I am going to return now to Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies. And he introduces in chapter 4 his own views on this. which are centered around expenditure of energy. The marginal productivity of increasing complexity. In this section, it'll be useful to break complexity down into several of its constituent parts and examine these individually. The constituents include agriculture and resource production, information processing, socio-political control and specialization, and overall economic productivity. In reality, of course, none of these is an independent entity. They form together an interdependent system that can be divided only artificially. They are separated here solely for the purposes of analysis and illustration. All of these spheres of activity represent investments by human populations in stability and welfare. The examples that follow are drawn from a variety of cases spanning the last several hundred years. Many are drawn from recent history. It might be worthwhile to point out that I do not imply by these illustrations that any of these societies is in immediate danger of collapse. The examples merely show what are common problems faced by all complex societies. The relationship of these problems to collapse varies with the historical context of individual societies. Agriculture and resource production. In 1965, the economist Esther Boserup put forward the radical thesis that increasing intensity in agricultural use of land is brought about by labor investment that is disproportionately greater than the returns received. Thus, although productivity per unit of land increases under intensification, productivity per unit of labor actually decreases. Boserup developed an idealized and, as she recognized, somewhat arbitrary typology of agricultural land use. Her idealized types are as follows. 1. Forest fallow cultivation, also known as swidden, milpa, or slash and burn. This is the system in which plots of land are cleared in forest and planted for a number of years. As yields decline and weeds encroach, the plot is abandoned to forest succession and not used again until forest has been fully established. This fallow period may be as long as 25 years. 2. Bush fallow cultivation. This system employs a shorter fallow of between 6 and 10 years so that no forest can grow. 3. Short fallow cultivation. Fallow under this regime lasts only 1 or 2 years. 4. Annual cropping. This is not really a fallow system, except that a period of a few months is left between one harvest and the next planting. 5. Multi-cropping. This is Boserup's most intensive system of land use, although it may be practiced in only a few favorable regions that do not have seasons of extreme cold. Boserup argues that through such factors as increasing land preparation, fertilization, and irrigation, human labor per unit of agricultural output rises throughout this sequence. She proposes that the factor inducing agriculturalists to undertake such increased labor for diminishing marginal returns is growth of population. Expanding population inevitably strains each successive form of land use, forcing a shift to the next one, so that the productivity of labor inevitably declines. Boserup's framework is generalizable to other types of subsistence regimes. Ashford and Ash, for example, have developed a compatible framework to explain change in hunter-gatherer subsistence from natural resources that are nutritious and easily processed to ones that are less so. Mark Cohen has argued that the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture can be understood as an adaptation to population growth, with such growth ultimately requiring the development of a more intensive and more costly system of resource production, agriculture. Hunter-gatherer foraging strategies are not immediately germane to the matter at hand, but these two studies do illustrate the universal nature of the economic process Boserup described. Boserup's framework has been subject to some debate, particularly in the driving role of population growth. That debate will not be reviewed here, for it is not necessary to accept the demographic stress argument to grasp the point of immediate relevance. This is that marginal returns on agriculture in a subsistence economy decline with increasing labor. That point can be amply illustrated. Clark and Haswell have shown that in subsistence regimes, both the average and the marginal return on agriculture do indeed decline with increasing labor. This can be readily verified by figures that he provides. Animal husbandry follows the same pattern. The labor-intensive nature and the costliness of animal husbandry is well known. Illustrating this point, the canals and steam railways that accompanied the development of industrialism in England were seen, at least in part, as a means of reducing the competition between people and horses for the produce of land. Fred Bateman has investigated changes in labor efficiency in the American dairy industry between 1850 and 1910. There was no major technological breakthrough in this interval, but other changes took place. One major shift was the widespread extension of dairying into the winter months. Another was improvements in feeding. Still, a third was the addition of stricter sanitation requirements. All of these added to the labor requirements of dairying, although yields did not increase proportionately. Figures presented show that between 1850 and 1910, dairy output per unit of labor declined by 17.5%. The investment that the human species as a whole makes in overall nutrition, moreover, reaches a point where further investment gives a declining marginal payoff in enhanced life expectancy. A figure provided shows that nutritional level varies non-linearly with life expectancy, so that the productivity of nutritional investment for producing longer life declines as such investment increases. Complex societies depend on the production of other resources besides agricultural crops. Energy and minerals production, as the modern industrial world is well aware, follows the same productivity curve as subsistence agriculture, and for a similar reason. The fuel resources used first by a rationally acting human population and the mineral deposits mined first are typically those that are most economically exploited, that is, most abundant, most accessible, and most easily converted to the needs at hand. When it subsequently becomes necessary to use less economical resources, marginal returns automatically decline. And I will have more from Joseph Tainter tomorrow. And I'm just scrolling through these graphs here. But let's go back to the chat. I've talked about Tainter and his relevance to this discussion of multiculturalism. That Canada is a good example. In, say, 1966, Canada was something like 97% white. Shortly thereafter, the Canadian government, the elites, decided that Canada was too white, and this was a bad thing for some reason. Canada was noted for its social cohesion at that time, which is now completely collapsed. But apparently, a social cohesion, why would anyone want that? And so the introduction of large numbers of people from third world countries introduces stresses, all manner of stresses. So what to do about that? Well, obviously increase the number of newcomers that are causing stresses. But let's declare war against white people. Let's have anti-racism education. And there are bus boards just a couple of blocks from here that they're constantly changing. And they have faces of people, mostly third world people, that say you don't need to be racialized in order to be anti-racist. That the federal government is bullying employers all across Canada to commit to anti-racism studies. And of course, since by definition, only white people can be racist, this is agitation against white people. And of course, the agitation against white people leads to further stresses because non-whites claim that, yes, the data show that Canada is a white supremacist country, and thus it must be further destabilized. And of course, as we have seen, in the United States, people are killing each other because of this, or non-whites are killing white people because America is a white supremacist country, always has been, based on slavery, and slavery is long gone, but apparently that doesn't make any difference. And white people must be punished, sometimes personally, terminally, increasingly. Let's look at the chat. Halper says, Musk 2028, turn the moon into a universal homeless colony. Quachalango asks, can Oregon and New Jersey residents pump their own gas? Hello to More, please. I think that's a new name to me. How's everyone's gardens coming along? I was like that Simpsons episode where they moved to that town run by the super villain, says David Lenone. Yes, Hank Scorpio, who was voiced by the great Albert Brooks. Yes. Some good James Bond parody in there. Gloria Miller reports, according to Dr. Ron Brown, children's face masks increase carbon dioxide sixfold over acceptable levels. David the Gnome says, and they show the video advertising the town, and it shows the hobos becoming mailboxes. Hello to Yo Mama. Who else do we have here? According Oscar Toes, the CDC masks guard against headaches, but not mental illness. How would they guard against headaches? Gloria Miller says, science 2020 to 2022, a virus can be stopped with a dirty swatch of cloth. Science 2020 to 2022, a virus can be stopped with a dirty piece of paper. Oh, yes, the hammock district. Yes, this ideal, a town run by the supervillain. They had so many hammock stores that they had a hammock district. Let's see. Oscar Toe says Billy the Kid wore a mask that one time to rob a bank. So they're completely true science and red pilled. Hello to True Greenberg. And I'm just scrolling down here. Monica Wisniewski, quoted by Gloria Miller, the vaccine should be tested on politicians first. If they survive, the vaccine is safe. If they don't, then the country is safe. Hello to Pete Bauman. When I've seen lofty towers down raised and brass eternal slave to mortal rage. Oh, hello to John Smith, who writes, as a teen, always ended for Canada dudes because there are so many beautiful there and women there. And what happened? Well, since cable television came to Canada in the 1960s, Canadians watched American TV. Very few Canadians watch any Canadian cultural products because they're rubbish. There's lots of reasons why they're rubbish. I won't go into that now. But so Canadian thinking mirrors American thinking, despite what you'll hear. Oh no, we're completely different from Americans. No, it's not true. Now it used to be for several decades. You wondered why so many young film and movie stars, why are they Canadian? And I have a hypothesis to explain that they were hiring young Canadians instead of Americans because the Canadians were fresher. That is to say, less cynical, less depraved, less world weary, etc. But that advantage, I think, has pretty much disappeared. And now I'm going to talk about the most important thing in the world, which of course is the Ukraine. And President Zelensky, don't want to use that 26 letter of the Latin alphabet because I am assured confidently that use of such might be criminal. So we're talking about regime change now in Russia, and we've gone beyond that. Even more radical suggestions are being made. Now, here is a now hilarious story published by the Washington Examiner, which is, of course, a neocon organ, by Joel Gerke, Foreign Affairs reporter, December the 23rd, 2021. Let's see. January, February, March, April. Almost 4 months ago. It's not that long ago. Paranoid Putin claims U.S. is trying to partition Russia. Yeah, that's exactly the sort of thing he said because he's a madman, right? A madman. Russian President Vladimir Putin remains undecided about whether to expand the war in Ukraine, American officials believe, as a fusillade of aggressive rhetoric has set the stage for a suspense-filled holiday season. So now newspapers are reporting on, potential violence, mass violence, as if they're reviewing a TV show or a movie. Putin sent mixed signals Thursday as he claimed that U.S. and European powers aspire to orchestrate a breakup of the Russian state, but also allowed that recent diplomatic exchanges have been positive. Breaking up Russia? That's crazy talk. Oh, really? Is it? Here is a piece by Dan Negria at the National Interest. The breakup. Will Russia splinter over war in Ukraine? This is from April 9th, 4 days ago. I love the passive language there. And there's a list of various parts of Russia which apparently are somehow going to leave Russia. I don't know how this would work exactly. They just, a chasm opens up between Russia and these various constituent parts of it. This is a very long essay, and it goes into considerable detail, mentioning Chechnya, Dagestan, in Gush Etia, Kabardino-Balkaria, and Tuva, Khakassia, Tartarstan, etc., etc. And there's a lot of talk about this now. These things just happen. Oh, yeah, of course, Russia. I mean, it's ridiculous that Russia exists as currently constituted. It needs to be broken up. How? How is this going to be accomplished? Here's a piece at unheard.com. Freddie Sayers meets political scientist Sergei Somleny. How the war could lead to the breakup of Russia. Again, the passive language. As the war in the Ukraine has become more entrenched, there has been much discussion of the small Eastern European states which might be annexed into the Russian Federation. South Ossetia is now holding a referendum on whether it wants to rejoin Russia, and there's talk of Transnistria and perhaps even Belarus being absorbed by the Federation. Many fear that invasion of the Ukraine is only the start of wider territorial ambitions for Russia. Yes, now we're talking about Russia conquering all of Europe, right to the Atlantic Ocean, because that's absolutely a possibility, right? It's not something a mad person would say. But what if the opposite is true? Sergei Somleny is a Russian-born journalist and political scientist who predicts that within 3 to 5 years, Russia will break up into a group of independent states. He argues that Russia's many ethnic states are perfectly poised for secession, some with long histories of agitation and others with a newfound resentment of Moscow in light of the war. Now, I'm reminded, the neocons are crazy. They're absolutely crazy. It's a mystery religion, and the nature of that mystery is a death cult. After, even before 9/11, groups like the Project for a New American Century, neocons all the way down, who had some bold ideas about the Middle East and the Near East. And I'm looking at a map prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters, published in the Armed Forces Journal in June 2006. And Ralph Peters, who used to be all over the media and all over television, is a neocon and a nutter. So what the neocons wanted to do was to partition which countries? Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And based on this map, which you can easily find, Pakistan is, where did Pakistan go? There's very little of Pakistan left in this new map. And we have these strange new polities such as Free Baluchistan. Okay, and we have the Sunni Iraq and the Arab Shia state. Oh, and Free Kurdistan, which is now almost as big as Turkey. We have something called the Saudi Homeland's Independent Territories and the Islamic Sacred State, which includes Mecca and Medina. Keep in mind, these were supposedly serious people and powerful people who were openly calling for the greatest transformation, reboundaries since the end of the First World War. And they believed that, well, we have the power to do it, so why not? What's anyone going to say? Is anyone going to say no? Well, you may have thought that I was engaging in hyperbole when I said that it is the view of the neocons and many other elites in the United States that the only two countries on earth which actually enjoy sovereignty are the United States of America and Israel, and that the sovereignty of every other country on earth is entirely conditional on American approval. So Pakistan wasn't on board with the idea that Russians are monsters who drink baby's blood, and Zelensky must be supported at all cost. Guess what? We have regime change in Pakistan, which is entirely, of course, coincidental. Entirely coincidental. It has nothing to do with statements made by their head of state. We're going to see a lot of color revolutions. Yes, and you're going to be hearing about places like Dagestan. What the hell is that? No, we've always been tremendously interested in Dagestan and the plight of the Dagestani people. Oh, we have. Oh, okay, sure. If you say so. Yeah, definitely. I'm on board. Do they have a flag? You know, can I put that in my Twitter bio? Or can I put it on a shirt? Say, genocide. Absolutely right to call Russia's actions in Ukraine genocide, Trudeau says. I'm reminded of an actual genocide, which happened in Nigeria. And this happened not that long ago in a place which was called Biafra, May 6, 1967 to January 1970. That the Muslims who dominate Nigeria decided that the Biafrans were getting a little too uppity, and they also had oil, you know. So, yeah, we can deal with this with genocide. And what was the world reaction to this? Well, the Nigerian government, despite the fact that it has grossly violated the federal constitution, is absolutely right and must be supported. And of course, the fact that the Igbos, or Igbos as they're called now, are Catholic, well, why would you want to be on the side of those people? Again, in any dispute between Muslims and Christians, the U.S. State Department will always support the Muslims. Justin Trudeau's father was once famously asked about the genocide, and his response was, "Where's Biafra?" What a card, that Pierre Trudeau. Huh? What a card. And Pierre Trudeau's defender said, well, you see, he was actually making a serious point. You know, he was speaking out against tribalism, which is apparently a very, very bad thing. This story is from Richard Raycraft at CBC News. Prime Minister Trudeau told reporters that he thinks it's absolutely right more people are using the word genocide to describe Russia's actions in Ukraine, but stopped short of using the word himself. There are official processes around determinations of genocide, but I think it's absolutely right that more people be talking and using the word genocide in terms of what Russia is doing, what Vladimir Putin has done. Trudeau pointed to Russian military attacks on civilians, including the targeting of healthcare facilities and train stations, as well as sexual violence in the conflict. He also said Russia is attacking Ukrainian identity and culture. These are all things that are war crimes that Putin is responsible for. These are all things that are crimes against humanity. Civilians get killed in wars. They have always got killed in wars. This is not what genocide refers to. But, you know, genocide is a bad thing. Well, it is. So we accuse them of committing genocide, which means we can do whatever we like to them, up to and including regime change and partitioning their country. I know there's Ed West, who's a fine writer, has a Substack. It seems like everyone does, which is called The Wrong Side of History. And he has a post. This is from last month, although I only saw it for the first time a couple of days ago. The chilling return of shibboleths. Pronouncing a word in the wrong way can be fatal. And he begins, let's start today's column with a passage from the Bible, not one of those nice hopeful messages of love and forgiveness Jesus talked about in the Gospels, but rather a tale of blood-strewn ethnic violence from the Old Testament, the kind of thing that Samuel L. Jackson's character in Pulp Fiction might say before shooting someone. And the Gileadites took the passages of Jordan before the Ephraimites, and it was so that when those Ephraimites which were escaped said, let me go over, that the men of Gilead said unto him, art thou an Ephraimite? If he said, Nay, they said unto him, Say now Shibboleth. And he said, Shibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it. He said Sibboleth, because he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they took him and slew him at the passages of Jordan. And there fell at the time of the Ephraimites 42,000. As with most wars, West comments throughout human history, the conflict between the Gileadites and the Ephraimites was fought between two people who looked indistinguishable and could only be identified by their language. And so Shibboleth came to mean a tribal marker and one with a deadly history. That history is still being written in 2022, although I'm not going to share it. Some of you may have seen disturbing video currently going around social media showing a suspected Russian saboteur being interrogated by Ukrainian forces. The man is being asked to say the Ukrainian word palyantsaya, I'm sure I'm getting it wrong, a type of bread which Russians find hard to pronounce. The significance of this word was mentioned last month in this Politico article, reporting how Ukrainians were using the term as a way of telling friend from foe. It was being used as a password, a tribal identifier that is a shibboleth. Shibboleths have been a feature of ethnic conflict throughout history, often involving the names of food, and it's quite a bleak story. In England, it featured in the rural uprising of 1381 that at the time was called the Mad Multitude, but later became known as the Peasants' Revolt. It is a somewhat embarrassing passage of English radical history, uncomfortably put in with that succession of failed progressive patriots like the Levelers and Chartists. The tens of thousands of rural men who poured in from Kent and Essex may have had some coherent gripes to begin with, chiefly the poll tax and the imposition of maximum wage laws after the Black Death had raised the price of labor. But having crossed London Bridge, things deteriorated quickly. As with much of English history, booze was involved. The drunken mob burned down the Savoy Palace. They found the Archbishop of Canterbury and beheaded him, along with various other nobles. They set fire to buildings which they thought held records of debts. They attacked officials and tax collectors. They also targeted any foreigners they saw, and in one go, 35 Flemish migrants were murdered, having been identified by being made to say bread and cheese. A chronicler records, and many Flemings lost their heads at that time, and namely, they that not say bread and cheese, but case and brood. Yes, and he mentions the infamous Sicilian Vespers, the Matins of Bruges, and other such examples. And I was introduced to a character from history, my new hero, called Carlo Zeno, or Zeno. The Venetian fleet was captained by Carlo Zeno, nicknamed the Unconquered, which is a good nickname to have, and one of the most epic figures of all time. Orphaned as a child after his father was killed in battle, Zeno, I'm going to stick with that, had become a scholar, a musician, a priest, a gambler, a soldier of fortune, and on one occasion had been left for dead in Padua by robbers, and on another almost buried alive after a siege against the Turks, wrapped in a shroud and put in a coffin. The nails were going in when he showed signs of life. In another escapade, Zeno climbed up the side of a prison in Constantinople by rope to release the conquered emperor. And, oh yes, I have mentioned Russians with Attitude Twitter feed, which was very valuable because they're one of the few outlets that was actually trying to present news about what is happening. Guess what? They have been banned from Twitter. And as we always say, and that's a good thing, because Twitter and its fact checkers are the sole arbiter of truth throughout the universe in perpetuity. Let's go to Peter Hitchens, who has been let's say his writing sticks out like a sore thumb in the Mail. I know, he's with the Mail on Sunday, not the Daily Mail. The Mail has gone absolutely mad over Ukraine, and much of it is now unreadable. Some cold, hard facts they don't tell you about Ukraine. How long have Western countries been giving military aid to Ukraine? The U.S. has been giving Ukraine generous foreign and military aid since 1991, when Ukraine became a country. In the decade after 1991, Ukraine received almost $2.6 billion. In the years leading up to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, it was getting roughly 105 million per year, including military financing, most given long before any threat of Russian invasion. The US began supplying weapons in 2018. Britain began giving military aid to Ukraine in 2014 in the form of advisors and training. Did anyone ever try to solve the problem that some of Ukraine's Russian-speaking citizens did not want to be in Ukraine? A main reason for hostility between Moscow and Kiev after 1991? Yes, right from the start. On August 21st, 1991, 2 days after Kiev declared independence from Moscow, the then Russian President Boris Yeltsin said that the old Soviet borders between Russia and Ukraine would have to be redrawn to deal with this problem. He retracted this within a day, almost certainly thanks to pressure from the United States. By May 1992, 250,000 of Crimea's roughly 2 million, mostly Russian people, had signed a petition asking for a referendum on independence, enough to trigger a vote under Ukrainian law. On May 5th that year, Crimea's parliament voted 118 to 28 to secede from Ukraine, but the Kiev government prevented a referendum from taking place. Would it have been possible to change the borders of Ukraine peacefully to avoid this obvious problem? Yes, as European borders are not sacrosanct. The US and the UK, along with dozens of other countries, though not Ukraine, have recognized Kosovo's breakaway from Serbia in 2008. The whole of the former Yugoslavia has been scissored into many new states, mostly recognized by the majority of nations. Ukraine, for instance, was among the earliest countries to recognize Croatia's 1991 breakaway from Yugoslavia, then a highly controversial step. What is the biggest political snub in modern history? In March 2007, Vladimir Putin warned very specifically against further expansion of NATO. Just a year later, President George W. Bush announced that he wanted Ukraine to join NATO, wholly aware that his action would infuriate Moscow. It did. Is Russia alone in committing alleged atrocities in Ukraine? No. More than one allegation has been made, supported by apparent video evidence of Ukrainian soldiers killing or maiming captured and helpless Russian prisoners of war. It must be stressed that these claims have not been proven. However, it is incontestable that both Russian and Ukrainian forces were guilty of military actions leading to the deaths of civilians, including children, during the war which has raged since 2014 in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Could the current war have been avoided? Very much so. President Vladimir Zelensky was elected largely on a promise to seek peace, which he courageously did in 2019, but political rivals and hard-right militias both opposed him. On a visit to soldiers on the front line, he told one rightist who lectured him, "You can't issue me ultimatums. I'm the president of this country. I am 42 years old. I'm no sucker. I came here to tell you to move your weapons away from the front line." But in the end, Zelensky gave into the pressure and the peace deal withered away. Final question: whatever happened to the United Nations, which is supposed to prevent or end wars such as this? And Hitchens responds, "I have no idea. It seems to have evaporated." Well, the United Nations is the fig leaf for the United States government, just as NATO is a fig leaf for the United States government. Let's go to the Drudge Report and see whether World War III has broken out. Let's see. No, apparently it has not broken out. That's a good thing, right? I'm just gonna step out on the ledge here and just assume that mass killing, millions, tens, hundreds of millions of people or more, that avoiding that is a good thing. Let's take a look at antiwar.com. Pentagon top 8 arms makers to meet on Ukraine. Yes, it's trebles all around in the arms making industry. We used to call them, the merchants of death, but golly, that sounds kind of pacifist and probably, Nazi-esque at the same time. White House planning massive new military package for Ukraine. Stepping up rhetoric, Biden accuses Putin of genocide in Ukraine. U.S. Kiev cannot confirm alleged chemical arms. Kiev arrests former leader of Ukraine's largest opposition party because, our efforts in the Ukraine are all about freedom. Never forget that. And if it turns out that he shut down all these newspapers and television stations and arrested opposition politicians, that either never happened, is Russian disinformation, or is in fact a good thing. Ukraine rejects visit from German President Steinmeier. Putin says Ukraine talks at dead end, vows to complete goals of war. And is there any of these sites, all of the sites which have not taken a rabidly pro-Zelensky view, they're all going to be shut down by Twitter, and they're warning people to join their Telegram channels because they're just anticipating that the chop is going to come any day now. Moon of Alabama, which has 28.8K followers, is still up. New on Moon of Alabama, they have a website as well. U.S. military intelligence official refutes Russian atrocities claims. Oh, yes, Home of the Brave, Wyatt Reed, who's identified for some reason as Russian state-affiliated media, points out that Russians with attitude suspended from Twitter, Pepe Escobar suspended from Twitter, Scott Ritter suspended from Twitter, and ASB News suspended from Twitter. Yes, again, the Home of the Brave. We can't let people spread disinformation. What's disinformation? Well, the fact checkers will let us know what disinformation is. It is anything that disturbs the narrative. I mean, that's pretty simple to understand. Any reasonably intelligent person can understand what the narrative is, and thus it is our duty not to speak out against the narrative, because that is ipso facto disinformation. At Maps Ukraine, a very useful site. Meanwhile, I will pin my Telegram channel in case something familiar happens in the future. From 1 hour ago, already more than 3,000 Ukrainian prisoners in Donbass right now. I see there is a misunderstanding. 3,000 plus captives in total since the offensive started. However, most captives are from this week, which goes up to 2,000 plus. And Ukraine Maps writes, I believe that eventually Russia will propose a reconciliation deal with the Ukrainian soldiers who have not been brainwashed with Nazism, just like in Syria. They will give them the chance for soldiers to return in duty under command of the Donetsk People's Republic. What happened to the chemical weapons story of Azov and Mariupol? Already forgotten by their own media. Obvious, desperate lies learned from the white helmets. Yes, did we learn anything from Syria? No. No, we did not. And there is nothing to be learned from the debacle in Syria. Well, where my own country, along with Britain, the United States, and others, were dropping millions of pounds, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pounds of bombs on sand. Yes, that's what they were doing. As far as war crimes go, according to Nuremberg Accords, the terror bombing of civilian populations is a war crime. NATO employed the terror bombing of civilian populations in Serbia in 1999, and Canada was responsible for 10% of those missions. So I guess one can connect the dots. Clint Ehrlich writes, if Ukraine has really sunk the Moskva, expect immediate escalation from Moscow. There will be a political imperative for the Kremlin to push this setback from the headlines with positive news. We may see large-scale strategic bombing, something Russia has held back on to date. Don't you know how to switch to the latest tweets? Oh, okay. Yes, the flagship, the Moskva, was the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, supposedly badly damaged in a fire that detonated ammunition. Ukraine claims it hit the Moskva with 2 Neptune anti-ship missiles. And let's go to Summit News. Much favored by this live stream. Yes, Paul Joseph Watson has a video. The Brooklyn subway attack, he black. Yes, Let's not talk about that. Joe Biden had an unfortunate interaction with a bird. Steve Watson writes, Fox News host Tucker Carlson covered Elon Musk's apparent attempts to restore free speech to Twitter Tuesday, declaring that the SpaceX CEO's efforts are a direct challenge to illegitimate regimes trying so hard to control information through censorship. Pointing to Musk's intimations that he will crack down on censorship on the platform, Carlson urged that a free Twitter would mean an open debate about ideas on the single most important incubator of elite opinion in the world. It would mean a return to free and fair. Okay. Yeah, that thing that happens every 4 years in the United States. A system in which both sides are allowed to make their case to the public, and then the public can decide. It's called democracy. As I mentioned yesterday, Musk decided that he wasn't going to join the board of Twitter because it's suggested because that would constrain any attempt to achieve control of the company by buying more shares. Oh, yes, I saw this story. And I don't know. A lot of ruin in a nation, right? Well, in San Francisco, they seem to have run out of ruin. Outraged shopper, this is from Information Liberation. Outraged shopper complains that nearly every item in San Francisco Walgreens now under lock and key. That would be Antonio Garcia Martinez. Writes, every item in the San Francisco Walgreens is under lock and key, and he provides a photo. There's practically nothing you can buy without having to call an associate to unlock something. I've never been in a country that lives this way. Yeah, because apparently, homeless people, criminals, drug addicts are making the life of people in San Francisco. And these are rich people who live in San Francisco, because if you're not rich, you can't afford to live in San Francisco. And apparently there's nothing that can be done about it. How about let's not prosecute people who steal up to $900 worth of things? Because, what good would that do? What good would that do? Earlier this year, cop-hating Black Lives Matter agitator Al Sharpton threw a fit over his local convenience stores in New York, locking up my toothpaste, and demanded a police crackdown to address the BLM crime wave he helped bring to fruition. In Philly in 2017, the city council approved a bill to ban shop owners from protecting themselves with plexiglass because it represents an indignity to their minority constituents. The law was scheduled to come into effect in 2021, but appears to have been delayed as a result of our record crime wave. I'm going to talk about conservatism now. And you should not be a conservative. You may think that you are conservative, but if you are, don't call yourself that, because it simply emboldens our enemies, who will tell you what conservatism is. And conservatism, we learn from no less than David A. French, is actually classical liberalism. Oh, I thought conservatism, evolved as a reaction to Manchester liberalism. Nope, they're the same thing, and always have been, apparently. People are getting worried that some people are not following instructions. And someone called Barton Swaim had a piece April 8th in the Wall Street Journal, grumbles left and right. That's a William Buckley reference. 2 books on the past and future of conservatism. Conservatives in the U.S. act to moderate a liberalizing elite. They sacrifice that role by pushing big new ideas. I forget who it was. Was it Michael? I forget who it was who pointed out that they're admitting it. People like Swaim are admitting it up front, that they are the janitors of liberalism, that liberals mess things up, and maybe this can be ameliorated a little bit. Reversing it? No. That would be a bold new idea, and conservatives are not about this. Now, I'll just preface this, that, you've heard me say this before, but it's true, so I'll mention it again, that conservatism was essentially a coalition between the right and the left in America. When we talk about, the conservative movement, or what they called in the 1950s and 1960s, the new right. So in exchange for leftist support for what George Kennan dubbed containment of communism, the right would surrender on everything else, which is essentially what happened over time. Yeah. So the Soviet Union was formally dissolved in 1991, and the conservative movement should have been formally dissolved. But you think that these think tankers are going to give up their jobs? No, 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 no. So what happened? They went looking for other monsters abroad to slay. They were pushing for a war with China for some time. And then, of course, they discovered Iraq, which must be dealt with, and then Afghanistan, and now they've moved on to Russia, which must be destroyed. Because peace dividend, no, there's not going to be a peace dividend. Why would you want a peace dividend? That conservatives now congratulate a homosexual couple for somehow procuring 2 children. Conservatives, less so in the United States than in my own country of Canada, they cheer to the rafters the sexual mutilation of children and the jailing of those who would counsel against it. That's what, and David A. French, oh yes, just stop this ugly talk about grooming and critical race theory, because, again, conservatives exist to consolidate the gains of the left. So don't call yourself a conservative. So Barton Swain begins, the American right finds itself once again in the position of trying to remember what it wants. We have seen versions of this situation before. One sort of conservative blames another sort for what happens to be the unchecked advance of the left. Things are far more confusing this time. The present discord didn't arise from a punishing electoral loss, as in 1964 or 2008, but from the Republican victory of 2016. Nor have today's quarreling conservatives fallen out mainly over a discrete set of policy differences. Conservatives in the 2020s disagree about what it is they're trying to conserve. Well, you see, he's wrong right from the start, because conservatives aren't conserving anything and have never conserved anything. But he continues, one prevalent line of thought runs something like this: the post-World War II conservative coalition's stress on free market and individual liberty. Yeah, you certainly heard a lot about this during COVID-19, right? Yeah, the national conservatives, the think tankers or whatever, they were perfectly happy with our liberties being, extirpated. And the free market. Yes, apparently the free market is a thing that never changes. Of course, it's not a rigged casino. No, not at all. It's not a system whereby the 1% becomes ever richer and more powerful. No. Nothing like that. Anyone who would say that must be a Russian bot. Yes, this made sense during the Cold War, when Soviet totalitarianism threatened the West and tempted its intellectuals to embrace Marxian centralization. No centralization present in the West. No. But what's needed now is cultural and economic solidarity. This critique, popular among some self-described national conservatives, overestimates the good and underestimates the harm government planning can bring about. Still, it isn't an unreasonable argument. R.R. Reno's Return of the Strong Gods is an eloquent expression of it. But a number of vocal natcons, as they're called, take the complaint further. Not only is the Cold War era's conservative defense of markets and individualism no longer needed, they contend 20th century conservatives who promoted economic and personal liberty weren't conservatives at all, but right-wing liberals. Yeah, where's the lie? Deliberate, again, David A. French says conservatism is classical liberalism. Of course, they were once thought to be, this was once thought to be at the antipodes to conservatism, but no, it turns out they're the same and always has been. Deliberately or not, these conservatives, natcons, or liberal users of ironic quotation marks, guilty as charged, did their part to foster the moral anarchy of present-day America, and over time divested conservatism of whatever authority it might have used to stop the bedlam. This is more or less Patrick Deneen's allegation in Why Liberalism Failed. It is the animating complaint behind Josh Hawley's Common Good Conservatism and J.D. Vance's Welfare State Populism. These figures reject the distinction many conservatives want to draw between classical liberalism, which originated in the 17th century, and modern liberalism, born in the 20th. Oh, yeah, okay, sure, if you say so. Yoram Hazony offers a version of the same criticism, i.e., that Cold War conservatives accepted the major premises of liberalism and so seeded the field in conservatism, a rediscovery. You see, again, the planted axiom in this Swain Fellow's essay is that conservatism is classical liberalism. Okay, then why does it need to exist? In fact, the people who are called liberals now, in many ways, they are not. Liberals, as that term was traditionally understood, which is why I suppose people shouldn't become so attached to particular words. I mean, you had people claiming, look, I'm a liberal, the right kind of liberal, and eventually got to the point where people said, what are you talking about? Everyone knows what a liberal is. You want, legalized pornography, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. No. It's not like, well, those people lost. And the people in the conservative movement who insist that conservatism is not about free enterprise and the 1% becoming ever richer and more powerful and any remaining moral standards being abandoned, they've lost that fight within their own movement. David A. French considers Drag Queen Story Hour to be one of the blessings of American liberty. That's a quotation, okay? Because, oh, yes, of course conservatives are going to cheer literal monsters instructing tiny children in depravity. Are you an authoritarian or something like that? But back to Swaim. Hazony, an Israeli-born, U.S.-raised political writer and president of the Herzl Institute, posits an Anglo-American tradition of conservatism. That tradition understands Christianity as a necessary religious infrastructure to Western Republican government. Hazony mocks the term liberal democracy. Its chief proponents are statesmen who forced their nations to move backward in order to remedy the disastrous effects of specific courses of action. So, for instance, Hazony lauds the 17th century English jurist Matthew Hale for his part in restoring Charles II to the English throne, thus ending, I assume this is thinking, the radical protectorate in which religious liberty was given an early try, because conservatism is all about regicide, and it's always been about regicide. Yes, he who controls the past controls the future. Someone said that. Some of you might recognize the quotation. I'm just joking, of course. Other true conservatives in Hazony's pantheon include George Washington and John Adams, who restored traditional English rights to the colonists, but not Thomas Jefferson, a proponent of Enlightenment rationalism. Adam Smith is in not because he championed free trade, because he was an empiricist and not, like Jefferson, a rationalist. The original liberal, John Locke, who asserted liberty of conscience against absolute monarchy, is definitely out. Some readers will appreciate Hazony's adventure in political philosophy. To me, it all feels like a game of intellectual shuffleboard. Swaim says that conservatism is a capricious book with long theoretical discussions of conservative theory, foreign and domestic policy making, and religious and family life. What mars the book irreparably is Hazony's false rendering of modern conservatives' history. For decades now, Hazony writes, many prominent conservatives, or so-called conservatives, have had little interest in political ideas other than those that can be used to justify free trade and lower taxes. Absolutely true. And more generally, to advance the supposition that what is always needed and helpful is a greater measure of personal liberty. Also absolutely true. Thus, Drag Queen Story Hour is one of the blessings of American liberalism. His refusal to name these faux conservatives, together with these statements' maladroit wording, many have had little interest in ideas other than those that can be justified free trade and low taxes, suggests to me that Hazony, an otherwise capable writer, knows this statement isn't true. Yeah, that's definitely, you want to be on the side of people who accuse their opponents of making bad faith arguments. Definitely want to be in that group. So what is the criticism exactly? Swaim asks. Hazoni's lack of evidence for his own allegation puts me in mind of E.H. Carr's jibe about Herbert Butterfield's The Whig interpretation of history, which is absolutely true. The book, wrote Carr, didn't name a single Whig against Fox, who was no historian, or a single historian save Acton, who was no Whig. E.H. Carr. What do we know about this fellow called E.H. Carr? He loved the Soviet Union. Is he a conservative now? Is loving the Soviet Union, but not, of course, Russia. Is that what distinguishes conservatives from not conservatives? Hazoni does eventually find one full-on individualist, Frank Meyer, an early National Review editor and former communist. Meyer placed individual liberty at the center of his philosophy. Man, he wrote in a typical passage from In Defense of Freedom, 1962, is of such a nature that innate freedom is the essence of his being. Aha, of course, Meyer wasn't asserting the individual's freedom from any obligation to family, church, or nation. He was describing the importance of the freedom principle in formulating government arrangements. In the end, whatever we may say about Meyer, Hazoni finds himself in the preposterous position of arguing that post-war American conservatism wasn't actually conservative because a magazine editor in the 1960s was a libertarian. I don't know whether Barton Swain is ignorant or is being dishonest, because if he knows anything about Frank Meyer and the history of the American conservative movement, Meyer was one of the most important figures in it because of his doctrine of fusionism, as it came to be known. That is to say that conservatives were wary of libertarians or hated them outright. But no, these two movements should merge, which is pretty much what happened. With the result that no, social affairs, they're none of our business. Our business is to make sure, once again, that the 1% becomes ever richer and more powerful, and people get to do whatever the hell they want to do, because people's personal behavior is none of our business, you know? Oh, Matthew Continetti's The Right, the 100-Year War for American Conservatives. Matthew Continetti is, of course, Bill Kristol's son-in-law. And who would know better about conservatism than Bill Kristol's son-in-law? Paints a messier, and for that reason, far more accurate portrait of 20th and 21st century American conservatism. The conservative movement was always a motley assemblage of free marketeers, neoconservative reformists. Nope. The neoconservatives were latecomers. There was a famous unsigned editorial in National Review, of course, the flagship journal of the New Right, let's say 1973 or 1974, I'm thinking, come on in, the water's fine, in which the neoconservatives were invited in the conservative movement, which they then captured. And Russell Kirk, who wrote a book, The Conservative Mind, which came out in 1953, which was very influential on the so-called New Right, was booted out of the conservative movement, which he was one of the founders, because he made a joke about neoconservatives like Mitch Decter thinking that Tel Aviv was part of America. Oh my God, can you imagine? Let's see. Yes, apocalyptic paleoconservatives, populist reactionaries, Catholic intellectuals, evangelical campaigners, and a variety of weirdos and visionaries. Ayn Rand, Robert Welch Jr., L. Brent Bozell Jr., who eventually found themselves alienated or expelled from the movement. Continetti puts it this way: there is not one American right. There are several. His chronicle follows both the intellectuals and party elites on the one hand and ordinary conservative voters and activists on the other. A successful political movement must incorporate both elites and the people, he writes. Only intermittently, however, has the American right been able to achieve such a synthesis. This is why its victories have been so tenuous and why its coalition has been so fragile. Oh, the people. Oh, conservative cares about the people. Does it? That would be news to Kevin Williamson at National Review, who is a hick lib. And one gets the impression that were he ever given absolute power, he would lay waste to all of America that is not the cities, because these people are boobs, rubes, parasites, don't really deserve to exist. But this history of conservatism by Barton Swain is tendentious. Let's see. Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968, again in 1970, not by vowing to remake the world, but by vowing to clean up the havoc created by Lyndon Johnson when he tried to remake Southeast Asia. Well, if you've ever read Richard Nixon's memoirs, I highly recommend it. He admits to agonizing after being elected president in 1968 over Vietnam. And I remember when I read this, I wanted history to change. And, he said that people said that, look, the war in Vietnam's not working and it's a Democrat war, not a Republican war. And I'm thinking, come on, Dick, do the right thing. Pull America out of Vietnam now. But he didn't. He decided that would be irresponsible and would, be a blow to America's allies, such the like. Oh, and he says, yes, communist subversion, the right's answer, Joe McCarthy. Oh, I see. It turns out that Joe McCarthy was right about everything, but the so-called conservative movement has decided that Joe McCarthy was a very bad man. The American right, he concludes, has always had its cranks and dreamers. The aforementioned L. Brent Bozell Jr., to take a memorable example, was the co-author with Buckley of McCarthy and His Enemies and an editor at National Review until 1963. Over time, he lost patience with American society's irreligion and libertinism. In 1965, he decamped to Franco's Spain and founded a Catholic magazine called Triumph. Eventually, he repudiated the American Republic altogether. His hyper-traditionalist outlook convinced Bozell, writes Continenti, that liberalism was a Gnostic heresy. The theocratic vision also made him alert to the heretical impulses of those branches of the right that stretched back to, wait for it, classical liberalism. The more things change. Well, Brent Bozell was a serious man, and the crisis in the Catholic Church from Vatican II and America's embrace of abortion disturbed him greatly. I read pretty much the entire run of Triumph magazine back in the 1970s, and so much of what Brent Bozell and the other people at Triumph was dismissed as hysterical hyperbole, and it's all come true. Once again, of course, people's personal behavior is no one's business and is not important. This is what modern conservatism tells you, which is one of the many reasons why you should have nothing to do with it. What I would like to see replace it is simply a movement which defines itself as a patriot movement. So it turns out that there's a new magazine called Contact, and apparently, this is threatening to the conservative movement. Oh, and here we have Matthew Continenti again in the Wall Street Journal. The return of the old American right. The Trump GOP resembles the party of Calvin Coolidge in its commitment to economic protection, restricted immigration, and non-intervention abroad. Boo, boo, Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was a great American and a great man, but he didn't want, America to become the third world, which, of course, that's America's destiny. Every conservative, respectable conservative, will tell you that. Stephanie Slade writes at Reason, and again, you look at the devolution of the libertarian movement, that apparently it's about dope and sex now. There used to be serious people associated with libertarianism, but nope. Gotta legalize dope, every form of it, and celebrate sexual libertinism and punish those that do not celebrate sexual libertinism. That's what libertarianism has been reduced to. In a new magazine, The Illiberal Right and the Illiberal Left Converge. Compact brings labor populism and political Catholicism under one roof. As you might expect from two Catholic converts known for their intense religious conservatism, the site boasts contributors such as controversial Harvard Law School professor Adrian Vermeule and articles bearing titles such as Why We Need the Patriarchy. Oh dear. The patriarchy is a terrible thing, and conservatives will tell you that. But close readers may notice something else curious besides. Is that a whiff of socialism? It's not your imagination. The final co-founder of the site is Edwin Aponte, identified in a New York Times write-up as a Marxist populist. According to the paper, he agreed to join up with Sorab Amari and Matthew Schmitz on the condition that more than half the articles focused on material concerns. What's wrong with that, actually? Again, you see, the planted axiom here is that America is or was some sort of individualist paradise. It has not been so since the presidencies of Franklin Roosevelt. And it has, and then we had the Great Society in the 1960s. But you see these radical conservatives, the bad ones. Oh, they're Marxists. They want to get rid of this libertarian paradise that is American business, and of course that is absolutely laughable. Absolutely laughable. Again, Alan Greenspan invented conservatism 2.0. One of the tenets is that really rich people should never be allowed to be less rich because they made stupid decisions. That's what the 2009 bailout was about. Yeah, and the Mexican bailout, right? There's another one. Yeah, they bet big. Wall Street bet big on Mexico, and it went south, no pun intended. But you gotta make them whole, right? Got to make them whole. COMPAC appears as a high-profile effort to introduce a united illiberal front. Yes, one that couples support for state enforcement of traditional social mores with a healthy appetite for a redistribution and central planning of the economy. For what it's worth, the first day's offerings point as well to a strong anti-interventionist bent on foreign policy. You could call it America first. You could call it America first. Now, the New York Times has noticed this new magazine called Compact. And again, I have to suspect that these people are frightened. The conservative movement doesn't frighten them because the conservative movement is controlled opposition. Jennifer Schussler writes in the New York Times, plenty of smart media startups these days believe they can deliver the final blow to the tottering neoliberal order. But Compact, a self-described radical American journal debuting this week, is taking an unusual, this was written March 22nd, is taking an unusual cross-ideological approach to the task of challenging, as a note from the editors puts it, the overclass that controls government, culture, and capital. We're here to start a two-front war on the left and the right, Matthew Schmitz said in a recent interview. I'm not much of an interventionist, he hastened to add, except when it comes to political polemics. Okay, so yes, apparently guilt by association. Apparently, yes, the very name is suspicious and quite possibly Nazi-esque. How could that word compact? Well, let's let the New York Times explain. Within hours of launching, the magazine had already drawn attention on Twitter, not all of it flattering. Some pointed out that Compact was also the name of a German far-right magazine whose accounts were removed by Facebook last August for violating community standards. Oh, it's a German magazine that no one in America has ever heard of. And how exactly is this German Compact? How is it exactly is it far-right? And violating community standards, let me take a guess that it said that Germany should be for Germans. I'm going to make that guess. Schmitz said the team had become aware of the German magazine only after it settled on the name, which was meant to invoke the Mayflower Compact. It has far less in common with us than the New York Post has with the Washington Post or the New York Times with the Washington Times, he said in an email. Could it be that conservatism is finally going to be smothered with a pillow? That conservative movement, that is to say, golly, I sure hope so. I sure hope so. Oh, Hunter Biden invested in virtual reality grooming game. But there's no such thing as grooming, and Hunter Biden doesn't exist. He's disinformation, which was invented by Russian bots. I mean, we all know that, right? And finally, I'll mention an essay in the Daily Mail by Dominic Lawson. And 3 years ago on this page, I took the plunge. To be specific, I wrote a column on how women's access to exclusive private spaces was being eroded in the name of trans rights, and it argued this was a threat to women's safety and dignity. I say took the plunge because I'd been warned that I would be attacked mercilessly by those who regard as evil any distinction drawn between biological women and those who have changed their gender from male to female. I also recall a conversation I had with Dr. Kathleen Stock, who has been hounded out of her tenure as a distinguished philosopher at Sussex University because of her so-called gender-critical views set out with remarkable clarity and force in her book Material Girls. Dr. Stock had warned me, you may well encounter very unpleasant consequences. If you do, please don't recant. I would rather you didn't write about this at all than speak out and recant. Yes, and that is an iron law. If you're going to say something, conservative or, spicy, or whatever the kids are calling it, yeah, make sure that you're not going to recant, because to say it and then to back down simply makes it worse for the rest of us. Dominic Lawson says, as it turned out, I encountered no abuse at all, just a lot of mail from female readers of this newspaper to the effect that they were delighted I was speaking up for them. Yet I'm sure that if I were a woman and had written such a column in the issue of April the 8th, 2019, I would indeed have been monstered on social media, especially Twitter. Look at what has happened to J.K. Rowling, who has endured death threats and the foulest of personal abuse after she defended Meyer Forsteter. This is the woman sacked from her job at the London office of a U.S. think tank, the Center for Global Development, after expressing her belief, one might say the fact, that it is not possible to change one's biological sex. One reason Rowling had encountered such a torrent of personal abuse after tweeting, I stand with Maya, is that she, most unlike me, is a writer of world renown and unparalleled success. When she speaks, the world listens. But the fact that she is a woman also has much to do with it. When I asked Kathleen Stock why that might be, she said men would prefer to attack women than other men because they risk less, and women would prefer to attack other women for the same reason. I have a different explanation. Yes, it is true that the attempts to cancel, or worse, women who defend what we know to be true about biology, this comes from the so-called anti-TERFs. And the anti-TERFs are overwhelmingly male to female transsexuals. They hate women. It cannot be overstated how much they hate women. And what they are saying is that we are the real women and you are not. In fact, can we even use this term women? They have come close to, abolishing, canceling women. Jumanji Brown asked, when testifying before Congress, what is a woman? I'm not a biologist. Yes, this is how far it's gone. And when one looks at these people, these anti-TERF people, they are characterized by not just misogyny, real misogyny, but barely restrained, and sometimes not restrained at all, rage. Let's have a final look at the chat. The Right Honorable says, I despise conservatives. We had so much fun on Twitter in 2016 making fun of them. Let's see. The Police are generally considered a great band, but they certainly have their fair share of detractors. I like them, but every so often a song would be, the bass player, the guitarist, Andy Summers, and the drummer, Stuart Copeland, their songs were performed, put on records. This was an error. This was a grave error. Andy Summers is a fine guitarist, and Stuart Copeland is a fine drummer. But as far as songwriting goes, no. If Sting had enough songs to fill the records, they just should have used Sting songs. Some of these songs, and I can't remember the one I'm thinking now, is just a lot of screaming. Pretty much the whole song is just screaming. Who else do we have? Hang on a second here. Let's go back to the chat for my final look at it before I sign off for the day. Okay. Yeah, someone making a joke about who the next James Bond is going to be. A white man. Well, I would have to think that it has to be a white man because that's who James Bond is, and a white Briton, in fact. I mean, you could make him black, or you could make him Asian, or something like that. But I don't think that the Chinese would be particularly pleased with an Asian James Bond. And of course, KMG's Jack. Oh dear, really? I got the pop collar going on here. I wonder how that happened. Thank you, Don Willis. Synchronicity 2 isn't very synchronistic, but I guess that's the point. What's the Loch Ness Monster have to do with suburban anxiety? Everything, man, says True Green Bird. Oh, okay. Picasso is more of a Kanye fan, says Oscar Toe. I like spirits in the material world, says Oscar Toe. Hello to Emmett Kelly's Earth. I always think of Adrian Ballou when I see the word moon, says Don Willis. Gloria Miller quotes Ambrose Bierce, the great American satirist. Peace, a period of cheating between two periods of fighting. Oh, I see. A lot of talk about the police and Sting in the chat today. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce this. Gameston says, I may have issues with Armari and Vermeuil, but for reasons totally opposite to Matthew, mainly how they are just neocons with tougher social conservatism. Anron says, Kevin is the king of pain. Is that a compliment? Okay. I think that's it for today. I like An Englishman in New York, but that's pretty much it, says Pelcasso 88. Do you ever hear a Godley and Krems song with that title? It's very, very strange. I mean, people remember the video, but the words are, wow. Wow. So that's it for today. Thank you all for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you would like to make a contribution to this live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations may be made to the live stream directly via interact@kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.